This is the second video about servlets, buttons, input, and JSP. We last left the story when we were about to invoke the view stories servlet. We're going to kind of pick up this thread, but I kind of want to jump ahead a little bit. So let's go back to this website here, and I've typed the name Sam, and I'm hitting a button, login, because Sam already exists, and it has invoked we're kind of jumping in here, and we're going to look at how does it get this number 7 on this page. Let's just kind of look at that for a second. So this page that's being displayed, it comes from the view stories JSP file. And if you look at it, I'm going to go down to this part. It's right after the oh no. It says stories. It says 7 stories. And here it's doing it, and you can see there's some really special syntax here. This is not an HTML tag. This is special syntax, the angle bracket percentage equal sign, and notice there's an equal sign there, and it's closed off with a percentage angle bracket. And in between, I am using code here. This is Java code to access the length of some variable called stories, which is kind of wild. I just have that right in the middle of all these other HTML tags. If I hover over it, you could even see in IntelliJ it's telling me, well, stories is an array of story models. So how do I have that? How can I do that? Well, you have to do some tricks, and you have to be very careful of your syntax. But basically, at the top of the page, I have some other special syntax. I have angle bracket percentage. Notice there isn't an equal sign there. We're going to talk about that difference a little bit later. And it's basically saying, well, you know what? I want you to do, just like you have in Java, I want you to import something. I want you to import this class models.userModel and models.storyModel. Basically, it's pulling in these classes. So now this page knows what those classes mean. And we're also saying that this page has Java on it. And then we start off the HTML page like normal, but the thing that's unusual is when we hit this part of the page, right at the beginning of the body, we have the angle bracket percentage again because we're about to have some Java code. And here we just have out and out Java code, and it says, hey, I want to declare a user model named user, and I want you to get that user model from off of the request. So before this JSP page was invoked, viewstories.jsp, somehow I associated a piece of data, which is a user model, with this request, and I put it under an attribute named user. Now, it's slightly confusing here because I'm kind of using user in multiple contexts. I have a user model variable called user, but I also have an attribute who happens to be named user. But I could have called that u or something else. It doesn't have to be user. Anyway, expects this attribute user to be associated with the request. We're going to see how we did that later. It's saying you should grab it and you should have it. Now, I put some code in here to make it safe. I said, well, if you try to get this attribute and you don't see it, meaning you get back null, well, just kind of fake it. Create a user model, create a new one, and set the username to anonymous because I don't know what the heck the user is. Same sort of thing's being done with stories. It says, oh, I expect on the request there to be an attribute called stories. And grab that data, and I am casting it to an array, a story model array, so it better be that. And then again, I kind of fake it out. I say, well, if you didn't get stories, then let's just say you have an array of no stories. So here I'm grabbing data from the request. I'm getting it out of attributes. Yeah, undo that little change there. Okay, now we're going to go down on the page. We just have HTML tags, and then we come to that oh no, which was, where was that oh no? That oh no is down a bit. It's right here. There's no no. Here we're taking that variable stories that we got out of the attribute up above. And here we have an equal sign. You use the equal sign when you're putting in the HTML a specific single value. So that's not normal Java code there, right? There's not a semicolon on that line. Here I'm saying, hey, I expect you to be able to access this single value. So that's why I have the equal sign there. And I take stories, that array, and I ask for the length of it, and that is doing 7 there. This stuff here is really the exact same thing. So here, and notice how tricky the syntax is. I have a for loop, Java code. Here, I begin the for loop here, opening brace. I close the for loop here, closing brace. That's Java code. It has to be inside these angle percentage brackets. And in the middle of that, I have HTML, LI's line items, just HTML. But in this line item, I'm like grabbing pieces out of those objects I created up above. So I say, hey, angle bracket equal, get stories I, so I can use the variable I created in the loop up here, get the username from it, close angle bracket. That's putting the name, whatever, Fred, whatever in the story. And then the story itself, same sort of thing, angle bracket, percentage equals, stories sub I, get the story. So that is how I'm doing all of the stories. Let's look at one more thing on this JSP page. If you look at this page, you'll see in the navigation bar, I have the person's name, Sam. What's going on with that? So if we look in the JSP, we see right here in that tab, Stories Rating, I have a tab. I'm grabbing the username, user, get the name, and I have it in angle brackets equals. And this is the navigation bar. Okay, now let's figure out how did we get this information into the request so that the JSP page could get it. How did that all happen? Well, it's kind of a continuation from where we were in the last video, where we were in the welcome servlet, and it's, somebody pressed a button on the page, on the first page, and it came into the welcome servlet, the do post, and it figured out the button, and it figured out the username, and it in this case we went into Sam, so it was a login case, and we grabbed the user, and we know who the user was and everything. It's not this case, everything was fine. And we drop down here. So right now what we're saying is, all right, well, this request that just came in, we're going to kind of work with it. And in the request, we're going to set an attribute. And we could name the attribute anything, but of course we're going to call it user because that's kind of a good name for the user. And we set that attribute. And where are we going to go next with this request? We are going to take the request and we're going to dispatch it off to the View Stories servlet. So we're going to go look at that View Stories servlet. And that's going to determine what page should get shown next. So the View Stories servlet, we take View Stories, and if we looked in this web.xml, it would tell us, oh, well, View Stories corresponds to the View Stories servlet. And we're going to look there. But notice already we're kind of setting up this request that we're going to use on the View Stories JSP page. We're setting an attribute in the request called user, but we also have to set up the stories. So let's see how that's done. So we go over to the View Stories servlet. Now, when this was invoked from here, we did a get. So when we're over here in the View Stories, there's different things you can do in the servlet. We're not in the post case. The post case is invoked when somebody hits a button on the page to submit, but that wasn't the case the way we invoke this servlet. We didn't invoke it that way. So we're in the simple get case. Those are the two main methods. The do post corresponding to a button press or submit, and do get where no button was pressed. So we're in the do get case. And I'm still preparing this request and getting it loaded up with data that the JSP page needs. And you can see here I'm calling JSP page, so I'm about to call it. I've already shoved user in the request. We saw that right before we came to this method. And here I am loading stories into the request, and I just broke this out to a separate method. So load stories into request, takes the request, and let's see, what does it do? It goes to the story DAO and it says, hey, get me every single story you got. I want them all. And it throws them in a story list. And then I have this little, this is kind of confusing when I went to do this. I had some issues with taking this type, an array list, which is what my DAO returned, and it didn't like me storing that in an attribute. So I had to take my story list, which was an array list, and convert it to just a normal array. So I did that conversion from an array list story model to just a story model array, kind of a simpler structure. And with that simpler structure, I can set that as an attribute. And there I have set up the stories. So basically here I set the stories up in the request. Prior to calling the view stories servlet in the welcome servlet, I set the user on the request. Back to view stories servlet. And then I say, in the do get, I say, okay, well, I now want you to dispatch this out to viewstories.jsp. And in viewstories.jsp, I'm all set to go. I have everything I need. I can go to the request and grab the user because I set that. I can grab the stories because that was set in the attribute. I can intermix them in the page. My page has buttons on it. Let me just look at it again. What buttons do I have? I have a submit button and tell your story. So here I have a okay, that's the nav bar. This is the list of stories. Okay, here's the bottom part. Here I have a button, submit, and I have an input called tell your story, blah blah blah. And then because I have a button on this, I must have an action around this whole thing somewhere. So if I go up, okay, the action is view stories. That's where I gonna go when they hit that button. So when they hit this button, now this, just to keep clear, because it's getting kind of confusing now, because now we're using view stories in a different way. This is what, when I put in a story here like this, let's say, my car got a flat tire. I'm on this page, I hit the submit. I'm ending up in this, I'm doing this action, view stories, but now it's the post method. And view stories means invoke the servlet. So I go back to the servlet. I'm not in the do cat because that was kind of a different case that we just looked at. Now I'm in the do post. And the request has come in. And since I'm here, I know the button was submitting a story. There I'm grabbing the button, but let's see, do I check it? I guess I actually do check it. Yeah, is it submit? And the story itself, the text, was on that page, so I can grab that from the request. I have the story text. So I have my add story method that's defined down below. Not very interesting, but just adds the story. So I've added the story. Now where am I going to go? Well, I'm going to stay on the view stories page, right? Because I didn't go anywhere. I stayed on the page. But, I'm about to invoke viewstories.jsp. But before I evoke it, I better get that page all set up. I better load the user into the request, the username, because I need that at page. And I better load those stories into the request, right? Because now they're different. There was 7 stories and now there's 8 stories. So I have to reload that to the request. I do that. I go to viewstories.jsp and I end up right back where I started. Okay, so this is confusing. It was kind of thrown at you all at once. And when you go to do this stuff, here's some advice. 1, do baby steps. Do a little teeny piece at a time. Just get the button there. See if you can press the button and put some code in the do post that doesn't do much. You need to know how to use the debugger. Hopefully I'll talk about that and show you how you can debug, because it really helps you see what's going on. Be super careful of your syntax. The way I do the syntax on all this stuff is I copy it, right? So if I'm making a new one of these servlet things, I sure don't type that by hand because I don't want to make a mistake in it. And I use an example of code to create my new example. But no matter what you're copying it from, make sure that you kind of have a decent understanding of how the code's working, maybe not all the details of it, but kind of a rough understanding, because if you don't have that rough understanding, you're kind of gambling, because when you go to try it, if anything goes wrong and you don't sort of have a grasp on it, it's super hard to debug because you're kind of in like a confused wasteland, and it's really hard to get yourself out of that if you don't kind of have a basic framework. And that's it for this video.